Hello there, Rajiv. How are you?
I'm well, Glenn. How are you?
I'm doing fine. This is Glenn Loury at The Glenn Show, bloggingheads.tv, sponsored by the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs here at Brown, where I'm a professor of economics and of international and public affairs. And I'm talking to Rajiv Sethi, who is professor of economics at Barnard College, Columbia University, an old friend of mine. Welcome again, Rajiv.
Thanks, Glenn. It's been a while.
It has been a while since we've done more than one occasion in the past, conversations here about economics and other things.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to be able to say that today's topic is your book with Brendan O'Flaherty, Shadows of Doubt, which has just been published by Harvard University Press. If I had been able to find my copy, I couldn't find my copy. I hold it up right now. But people should be aware of the fact that you and Dan have produced a very interesting, in-depth, thoughtful, provocative, comprehensive review of issues of race, stereotyping, and the crime, punishment, and policing nexus. And so I wanted us to talk about that. So how would you like to introduce this conversation about your book?
Well, I'll just say that what the book does is to look at how stereotypes contaminate interactions at every level of the criminal justice system, starting with crimes, interactions between victims and offenders, officers and suspects, jurors and defendants, judges and people who are up for bail, parole boards, and so on, because people are interacting with strangers. So, most of the interactions that take place in the criminal justice system involve people who don't know each other very well. And so superficial markers, they can be related to race, ethnicity, gender, age, and so on, but they can also be related to piercings and tattoos and other factors. They condition people's beliefs, and it's and then they determine judgments about guilt or innocence or suspicion, and so on and so forth, in ways that just affect the way things play out. And we try to basically bring our prior work as well as the work with which we were familiar to a broader audience. So this book is not technical in nature. It's written for a general audience. And the way I describe it is it's a book written by two economists, but it's not an economics book. So we really had to start actually with the psychology literature on stereotypes and bring in a lot of the insights from legal scholars like Randall Kennedy, for instance, James Foreman Jr., John Pfaff, and so on. So it's really not an economics book. Although, the key economic insights are coming from an understanding of incentives. So, how stereotypes, whether they're rational, irrational, whether they're resistant to change, they exist. And once they exist, they create incentives for people to seek out certain interactions or avoid others. And it's those incentives that I think an understanding of economics can help us tease out and trace.
Okay, well, let's start with the basics. What do you mean when you say stereotype?
So what we mean when we say stereotype is basically the assignment of an individual to a group to which we imagine they belong, and then the assignment to them of characteristics that we think of as being typical in that group. So the psychologist Jerome Bruner calls this a special case of equivalence grouping. So basically treating objects or people or anything we come across as being somehow endowed with characteristics that are typical of some group to which we assign them. He calls this going beyond the information given, and it's a cognitive necessity. So we do it, which doesn't mean that it's statistically accurate or that we process information in statistically reasonable ways. And this is really where we had to depart from the economic methodology as far as the beliefs are concerned, because once the stereotype is in place, it affects the way in which information is received and processed. And, stereotype confirming evidence is treated differently from stereotype disconfirming evidence. And, psychologists have looked at this for a century now. But the standard economic methodology, which, assumes sort of, Bayesian inference and common priors and so on, we had to depart from to begin with. But then we bring in economics by looking at the incentives that are created by these beliefs, wherever they may arise from. Yeah.
Hold on now. So we got categorization going on, that the root of stereotyping
Yes.
is the cognitive activity of creating groups and assigning people to groups.
Yes, without which we couldn't navigate a complex world. That's a cognitive necessity.
Cognitive functioning. That's an inescapable reality of our condition.
Yes. So the aspect, grouping and then categorizing and then endowing people and objects with characteristics that are typical in the groups to which we have assigned them is inescapable. We can't escape that. But there's heterogeneity in the degree of self-awareness with which we do it. There's heterogeneity in the content of stereotypes, and this changes very dramatically over time across generations. Beliefs about a particular group can change very dramatically, and we can be more or less receptive to stereotype disconfirming evidence. But
okay, I wanted to start with the fact of stereotyping, and then get to the question of the accuracy, the rationality, and so on. And I wanted to establish that you're not saying it's good, you're not saying it's bad, you're saying that is the way that imperfectly informed agents are necessarily going to have to formulate their beliefs about the world by creating categories and by making distinctions amongst categories of some kind of imputation or belief about the people or the objects that fall within a given category.
Yes, that's basically the way that we have defined stereotypes. It's normatively neutral. The word often carries a negative connotation, but I think that when one thinks about people being treated as morally inferior or deficient in some way, then you're moving into the realm of stigma, what you call stigma in your book. And I think I'd like to distinguish that from stereotypes. Yeah.
Understood. Yeah. And the basis of this categorization, the criteria used to group or cluster individuals or objects can be varied. It can be race, age, gender, sexual orientation, demographic characteristics of that kind.
Yeah, accent or anything, yes.
Accent and other modes of self-presentation, some of which might be subject to manipulation by the people who are being observed, others of which might be more immutable.
Yes.
But this is stereotyping. Now, okay, what about the rationality of the beliefs that people have about, say, older people or people who suffer from a venereal sexually transmitted disease, or people who speak with a Southern accent, or people who are New Yorkers and proud of it, or people who are Black, or people who are gay?
Yeah.
What about the tendency of people to say of such groups, they are like this or like that? Are you concerned that these beliefs that are the substance of stereotyping might persist as being erroneous imputations or characterizations of the groups in question? And how does that factor into your analysis?
Yes, they can certainly be erroneous, and erroneous beliefs can persist because of the way in which we process evidence. So that's
that business about confirming gets a lot of weight, and disconfirming gets ignored.
This goes back to Walter Lippmann's work in 1922. Walter Lippmann actually he coined the term stereotype as a sort of a picture in the mind.
In that book, Public Opinion.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. I mean, it's really, really worth reading. It's almost 100 years old now. And he says, something to the effect of, I wish I could remember exactly, but I think he says, we do not see and then define. We define first and then see. And then he goes on to say, what is alien will fall upon unseeing eyes. It's a beautifully written book, but basically he's making this point that once we have defined, we see things differently, and then this can entrench erroneous beliefs. And sometimes the beliefs can be, fairly accurate, and sometimes they can be very erroneous. I can give you one interesting example about beliefs that have shifted very substantially over the last century or so. So after the extension of the franchise through the 15th Amendment to include Black men in America, a lot of the states tried to find constitutional ways of preventing Black men to vote. No women could vote at that time, until much later. Mm-hmm. but many states, and Mississippi was one of these states, and they were very explicit about doing it, and they carried out what today we would call, felony disenfranchisement. So they said, okay, let's take a category of felonies, and those who have been found guilty of these crimes should be prevented from voting. And there's a Mississippi Supreme Court ruling from the 1890s, which explicitly divides up felonies into those that would cause you to lose your right to vote and those that would not. And it's completely fascinating because, they say, oh, we're going to allow people who have committed robbery and murder to vote, but not people who have committed, let's say, larceny or fraud. And so, these very serious crimes, what today are classified as violent crimes, robbery and murder, were not disqualifying as far as the franchise was concerned. And this was very explicit in the Mississippi Supreme Court ruling. And the rationale was also explicit, which is, it's something that you wouldn't see these days, which was basically that they thought that robbery and murder were so-called robust crimes. They were not furtive. And these robust crimes were more likely to be committed by whites. Whereas the more furtive, the more sort of underhand, the more sneaky crimes, like larceny and fraud and getting money under false pretenses, were more likely to be committed by African Americans. And therefore, they disqualified people. So they were facially neutral laws. Now, later, the Supreme Court ruled that, this is not permissible under the Constitution. But at that time, it was, or they felt that it was. And so they explicitly excluded fraud and explicitly allowed murder. and that was based on a stereotype that no longer exists. I mean, that stereotype is long vanished, right?
The stereotype being that blacks commit furtive crimes.
And that whites are more likely to commit the so-called
robust crimes.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to fathom, not having been there. I see a difference, but I'm not sure I see the distinction. But in any case, okay. But so we were talking about whether evidence was properly or rationally processed as people update or alter through experience what it is they believe to be characteristic of certain categories or of people who might be the subjects of stereotyping. And you were keen to emphasize that you depart from the typical economist view and not taking as given the accuracy or rationality of the stereotyping. Can you give me an example of a context where that's an important distinction, where you believe beliefs having been assumed to be necessarily rational is a bad way of framing the analysis?
Yes, I can give you a couple of examples. So let's take the case of robbery, for instance. And, victim selection. So, robbery begins with a victim selection decision on the part of the offender. There's lots of people who are sized up as victims and then passed over, and they don't realize it. They don't realize that they were potential robbery victims and they're not selected. The selection of victims is very much based on a belief about the likelihood of compliance. It's really not so much based on a belief about the likelihood of cash or other kind of transferable property, because the key thing for offenders really for robbery is compliance. And, there are beliefs, especially sort of beliefs about violence, beliefs about, whether or not, one would be subject to violence if one resisted. And these beliefs are actually contingent on race. And there are, it's more likely that a white victim who faces a black offender will believe that they will be subject to violence in the face of non-compliance than a black victim facing the very same offender. So those two beliefs are systematically different on average. And that wouldn't be the case if they were both statistically rational. Now, what that does is it means that white victims are especially attractive to black offenders. And you get patterns in the data on robbery. Robbery is the only crime really that crosses racial boundaries very substantially. But it almost never crosses boundaries when the offender is black. So about 40% of robberies in the United States today are white on white. But white robbery offenders will never target black victims. Black robbery offenders are quite keen to target white victims. And this is partly because of actually a stereotype about a stereotype, a belief that the victim will hold a irrational, exaggerated negative stereotype about them, which makes it easy to commit that particular crime.
How do you know it's irrational? This is the belief that the potential victim has about the likelihood that he will meet with violence from the offender if he resists the offender. And you assert those beliefs for both Black, and those beliefs differ as between Black and white potential robbery victims, with white victims ascribing a much higher probability that should they resist, they will meet with violence if the offender is Black.
How do I know
Black
this?
Victims. And you're saying, let me just be clear, you're saying somebody must be irrational because if white and Black victims have different views about the likelihood that a Black robber will bring violence to them, they can't both be right. And you're saying that the white victims overestimate the likelihood of violence, and I'm asking you how you know that.
The most direct evidence is from ethnographic studies of active offenders. So there's a book called Armed Robbers in Action by Scott and Decker. I don't know if you, Wright and Decker. I don't know if you know this.
I've only seen it through reading the references at the back of one of your papers.
So they go out, and it's an ethnographic study of active offenders, and they ask them, and there are people who say, look, there are folks who think I'm Idi Amin. I'm not going to hurt them, but they have this view that I'm Saddam Hussein or Idi Amin, and that that they just will hand over their money. And then so the evidence is ethnographic and anecdotal. So I mean, the best example that I can think of is actually from Brent Staples' his memoir. This incident. I mean, your listeners may not know it, but when he was a grad student, he was doing a PhD in psychology at University of Chicago. He liked to walk along the lake, and Chicago very well, of course.
I do.
And this was in the 90s, I think, or maybe late 80s. The memoir was from the mid 90s, and so you can think back on that time and place, and people would shrink with fear. They'd show visible signs of fear if they were white of this young man. He was then a young man, tall and African American, and basically, he started to whistle out of nervousness. This is how he describes it, and this is a very, very well-known story because Claude Steele used the term "whistling Vivaldi" as a title for one of his books. And so he started to whistle. He was very good at it, and he whistled the Four Seasons by Vivaldi. He whistled tunes from the Beatles, and completely shifted the stereotype. So the stereotype he was able to manipulate very effectively by whistling Vivaldi. But then, much less well known, which we discuss in the book, is that he just got sick of it. I mean, this is very common. People get fed up with the burden of trying to invest resources in changing other people's beliefs. And he got fed up of it and started acting in stereotype confirming ways, and realized very quickly that people were so terrified they'd hand over money to him even if he didn't ask for it. And so this is what I mean about the kind of evidence. How do I know it? I'm not using, I'm using statistical evidence at one level, from the National Crime Victimization Study, but I'm trying to make sense of it through ethnographic and anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, I'm just worried that some of these tropes or, sort of cliches about Black men are viewed to be dangerous and threatening. I'm a Black man of a certain size, of a certain age. I've lived through American society. I can certainly give you anecdotes of where people have reacted to me in ways that Brent Staples was describing, being afraid of me when I was no threat to them. Scattering the pigeons, isn't that what he called it? When he stopped trying to placate these frightened white people by whistling classical music in their ear to assure them that he was not a thug, he would take to walking right in their midst, straight toward them in an unflinching way, and watching them run for cover, couples separating to either side of the sidewalk as he would. I mean, you can judge that negatively if you like, but it's very. No. What I'm saying is, I think that. Let me give a concrete example.
Okay.
The talk.
Yeah.
The talk. So this is a stereotype. This is built on a stereotype that many people of color have about the police.
Yeah.
The stereotype being, and by the way, my wife, Lawan, exhibits this behavior. The behavior being, if I get stopped by a police officer, I have to be afraid for my physical safety because I'm Black. Okay. Now, it's a country of 335 million people or whatever, and there's so many hundreds of thousands and millions of encounters and whatnot. My guess is that the probability under ordinary conditions that a pedestrian, or I should say a citizen, a civilian who is pulled over for a broken taillight or a speeding ticket is physically assaulted by the police officer is indistinguishably different from zero, regardless of what the color of that person is. If I just did a head count of the frequency of the opportunity for this to happen and the frequency with which it happens. And my guess is that the fact of certain very highly prominent incidents, which do happen, in which police officers assault people of color, gets processed in a psychological way so as to enhance a belief that bears very little connection to reality. So it's that kind of thing that I also want to make sure gets on the table here. Do you disagree?
No, but actually you've made my point for me about stereotypes not being reflective of statistical reality, right? I mean, this is just another example of that.
Okay.
But frankly, the costs of being what you might call hyper compliant when you're stopped for a broken tail light or speeding or whatever it might be are relatively low. So even if the probability of harm is negligible, it doesn't seem as if it's necessarily irrational to engage in that kind of highly cautious or highly, careful, scripted behavior.
But doing so on the basis of race.
Yes.
The talk is about what one says to one's black son. If you happen to be an interracial family with black and white children, I'm not sure the white son needs to talk according to the cliche.
I think the idea, Glenn, is that if you believe that there's a small positive, even if it's close to negligible probability, that they've managed to encounter somebody who's hostile towards them and could find an excuse to do something. It doesn't have to be as serious as taking a life or committing an assault or the use of force. It could be just prolonging a search. It could be planting evidence. It could be all kinds of other things which are probably not as negligible in terms of likelihood. It doesn't seem to be particularly harmful to suggest to someone that they ought to be hyper compliant. I don't necessarily.
I'm not arguing against it. I'm using it as evidence of the fact that there might be an irrational estimation of a certain probability. The probability being of the event that the police officer assaults me without justification.
Our starting point in this book is that this is pervasive. I'm not trying to say it's these kind of erroneous beliefs are held only by white Americans. So I'm not trying to make that case at all. It's pervasive, and this is really what the psychologists have taught us. The literature on confirmatory bias says that we're all susceptible to it, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, age, and so on. So yes, I won't disagree with what you just said.
Okay, so we've been talking about what are stereotypes and what evidence people might have to persist in the categorical beliefs that they ascribe to different groups of people. You've only begun now, I think, to scratch the surface of what you and Brendan O'Flaherty do in the book in terms of taking this concept and using it to shed light on different aspects of crime punishment and law enforcement, police interaction. So can you talk a little bit more, for example, about homicide? You've been talking about robbery. I think you guys have some very interesting things to say about homicide. Tell me a little something about how you think stereotypes, whether racial or otherwise, factor into a subtle and nuanced analysis of the homicide problem in America.
So homicide is not just really the most serious crime. Actually, homicide can sometimes not be a crime. Homicide just refers to a killing, but an unlawful homicide or a murder or manslaughter is not only the most serious crime, but it's also the only crime that can be motivated by preemption. You wouldn't commit any other crime that I can think of simply out of the fear that it will be committed against you. But homicide is an exception. You may take you may take somebody else's life if you have nothing whatsoever to gain from it, except saving your own. And this is an insight actually that was expressed really well with in the 1960 book Strategy of Conflict by Schelling, and I know that you taught and worked with Schelling, so you're very, very familiar with these ideas. But the basic idea is that, what the way Schelling puts it is, self-defense is ambiguous when one is only trying to prevent being killed in self-defense and by the other party. And basically, the point is that if you fear being killed, then the preemptive motive comes into play. And what this does is it makes people who are feared dangerous, and it makes people who are dangerous subject to fear. They ought to be afraid. They ought to be afraid of preemptive action on the other on the part of others. And one of the things that can make you really fearful of being killed, if you happen to be involved in an escalating dispute, and a lot of homicides, surprising number, start out, as relatively trivial disputes about a debt or whether somebody slept with somebody else, or they just begin as relatively trivial arguments. Now, if you're involved in an escalating dispute, one of the things that can cause you to be fearful of being killed is if you believe that you can be killed with impunity. So if you believe that somebody can take your life and get away with it, that makes the preemptive motive much stronger, because they are less restrained, they are less constrained in their actions. And one of the things, this is something that has been true in the United States for centuries, across space, is that when the victim of a homicide is black, the crime is more likely to be done with impunity. That the clearance rate, the homicide clearance rate, which refers to the likelihood of a suspect being arrested,
very low.
It's very low. It's very low. I mean, Chicago is just astonishingly low, and and it's lower everywhere. If the victim is white, if the victim is black, than if the victim is white, across the nation. Now, there's two views of the reasons for this, which Dan and I call, not in the book actually, but more recently have come to call the community view and the law enforcement view. And so, what's the community? The community view is that black lives don't matter, that the law enforcement officers are not under pressure to solve homicides with black victims, regardless of who the offender may be, that there's no public outcry, that there's no media pressure, that, that basically that they don't care. And because they don't care, they don't put in the effort and the resources, and therefore a lot of these homicides remain unsolved. That's what we call the community view. Well, if you ask law enforcement officers, even those who acknowledge that, there have been times in history where people haven't cared and haven't, been interested in solving these crimes, that homicide detectives today in most jurisdictions face very strong incentives to clear every single homicide. And so their view, and they'd acknowledge that they can't do it as effectively, as reliably when the victim is black. But their reason for this is a lack of witness cooperation. Mm-hmm. And most of the crimes with black victims also will have black witnesses if witnesses exist. And a lot of the work that's involved in solving the homicide will require cooperation from people who have knowledge of the offense in some capacity. And if those people, for whatever reason, despise or distrust police or suspect that they may be themselves charged, for some trivial offense, or that they may have an unpleasant interaction or experience, they're not going to be willing to come forward as witnesses. And why might they distrust or despise police is precisely, rightly or wrongly, if they believe that the average person in law enforcement has a hostile view of them, gains pleasure from causing them distress, for instance. And this in turn then goes back to policing practices for much more simple crimes. So New York City at its peak about 10 years ago had about 600,000 police stops, the stop and frisk incidents in any given year. Now those stops involved less than 600,000 people because some people were stopped repeatedly. Now it's less than 10,000, partly because of certain lawsuits arguing against the constitutionality of the practice, but also because of the change of administration a few years ago. And we're down to less than 10,000 now. And there's some computer scientists at Stanford, Sharad Goel and his group at Stanford, who have looked at the data. And of course, you can't just stop somebody. It's not constitutionally permitted to just stop somebody because they're black or male or young. You have to have what's called reasonable articulable suspicion, and you have to actually in New York City fill out a form. that states precisely what your suspicion was. Now, they looked at these forms and
furtive movements.
For instance, yes. So the standard is, of course, much lower than probable cause, right? So reasonable suspicion is much lower than probable cause, but you still have to articulate it. You can't just say this person was, belonged to a particular demographic profile. So they looked at these forms, and they looked at, for instance, at the forms where the suspicion was of a concealed weapon, where the officer believed that they're going to recover a weapon, and about 97% of those cases did not lead to weapon recovery. So, a lot of those folks are being stopped explicitly under suspicion of having a weapon, and they don't have one. Some of those people, especially if they believe that they've been stopped based on racial profiling, are not going to then be inclined to come forward as witnesses, in cases that could help homicide detectives clear the really serious crimes. So there's this sort of, interaction between policing practices more generally and the ability to clear homicides. And if the ability to clear homicides is compromised, then you end up with a preemptive motive that can give you high rates of homicide. And this link is one of the things that we try to draw out in the book.
Okay, this is interesting. High rates of homicide being the only crime that might be committed to preempted having been committed against oneself. This kind of preemptive behavior more likely in the event that you think that you can be killed with impunity, which is more likely in the event that the police are unable to clear homicide cases, which is more likely to happen if witnesses don't come forward. But if witnesses are disillusioned or alienated from the structures of authority and policing in particular, they won't come forward. We're in a bad equilibrium with a high homicide rate. Yeah. How much of the racial difference in homicide, which is on an order of magnitude, it's like a factor of 10, the rates of homicide, do you think can be accounted for by the mechanism that you've just outlined?
So I think it's a non-trivial amount. It's and if you also allow for retaliation, so of course preemption is one part of it. But if you can be killed with impunity, then the incentives exist for somebody who cares about you, who did care about your life, to then act in a retaliatory manner towards the person who committed that crime. So there's retaliatory killings as well. So that are tied to the clearance rate.
But how much? I mean, 50%, 30%?
I don't know.
The disparity by black and white on the commission of homicide is huge.
It's huge.
As is the disparity by male, female, and the disparity by age.
Yeah.
So if I look at young black men, ages, 18 to 35 or something like that, I'm going to get a number that's 15 times higher than if I look at white men ages 35 to 50 or something like that.
No question.
And I want to know whether you think most of that is due to the phenomena that you're describing, or how you deal with that.
I'm reluctant to put a number on it, Glenn. There are, certainly if you look at the African American share of arrestees for homicide, and this is taking into account the fact that the clearance rate is low. Despite that, is about twice as high for what we call in the book crimes of destruction. So, for example, rape, or for aggravated assault and arson. These are not crimes that are motivated by the acquisition of property, typically. And homicide is an outlier there in the rates of arrest, despite the fact that arrests are less likely, clearance is less likely in the case of homicides when the victim is black. So I wouldn't...
I just want to be clear on the fact you're saying that for other kinds of violent crimes like rape or arson, there is a racial disparity, but it's 2 to 1, not 10 to 1. Is that what you're saying?
It's much less. Yes, exactly. It's much less than for homicide. So, but I'm still reluctant to put a figure on this because I don't have a solid basis for that. I just the thing is that there are situations. So there was a Department of Justice report on Ferguson, for example.
Yeah.
Actually, 2 reports after the killing of Michael Brown, and the one that had dealt with police practices identified, basically a whole bunch of practices where the community was being treated as a piggy bank for local expenditures. There's just, lots of very, very trivial offenses or non-offenses that were...
Well, I understand that that's true of many of those speed trap towns in suburban St. Louis. Some of them actually run by black administrations. It's not unusual for these little towns to do that, which is not defending it.
Yeah, no, but the particular report on Ferguson did identify racial character to this particular enforcement practice that people were targeted, But take for example Tim Scott's speech, right? Tim Scott, senator from South Carolina, is a conservative Republican on most dimensions, I would say. I don't know, but he made this speech that actually took a lot of people aback on the floor of the Senate a couple of years ago, where he described how soul destroying it was to be thought to be doing something wrong when he was just following all the rules. And he gave a whole bunch of examples. You remember the speech, including not being allowed into his Senate offices, while he's wearing his pin and being stopped. Paul Butler, in his book, Chokehold, he describes, looking down in the elevator, choosing which kind of car to buy, what kind of clothes to wear, and so on. Just because it just gets so tiring to have people afraid of you.
Yeah, but here's my problem. My problem is these fears, which may be empirically irrational, but are nevertheless explicable in terms of psychological processes, have a relationship to an objective reality, do they not? I mean, if indeed, let's take shoplifting.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the classic story that you'll hear. I've heard it many times. I've experienced it myself. I walk into a store, someone does. I'm looking around for something. I have money in my pocket. I intend to pay for what I buy. And I see myself being monitored or followed by someone who thinks that I'm a thief. Now, they base that on nothing. They don't know anything about me other than the fact that I look a certain way.
Yeah.
So obviously that, if you say soul crushing, okay, well, it's certainly unpleasant. It's certainly unpleasant. It's not a way that one wants to live in the world. On the other hand, I'm not sure what did I want the storekeeper to do, disattend the fact that A, he has a shoplifting problem, and B, most of the people that he's caught stealing his stuff look like me. Now, if that's simply false, if he's just laboring under an empirically inaccurate characterization of the world, that's one thing. And we need to disabuse him of his false belief. If it happens to be true in a certain city in a certain year, if it happens to be true, then do we not have anything further to say to him other than to wag a finger in his face about how it is that he has made someone feel uncomfortable by monitoring their movements in his store? Don't we need also to address ourselves to the individuals who belong to the group in question, whose behavior is poisoning the reputation of everybody in that group by stealing stuff that doesn't belong to them?
Think about the implications of what you're saying. We have standards of probable cause and even reasonable suspicion that we just talked about with regard to stop and frisk. What the logic of what you seem to be saying is, why bother? Why not just remove the standard of reasonable articulable suspicion, let the police stop, remove the constraint on police, we'll solve more crimes, we'll end up with more effective law enforcement if they could just racial profile freely. And if they could stop somebody without reasonable articulable suspicion, without having individual specific identifiers of wrongdoing that are not simply reflections of the demographic group to which the person belongs. Why not just remove that? Why not just remove that?
Hold on, let me just defend myself a moment. That's not what I'm saying. I'm certainly not trying to defend stop and frisk policing. What I'm saying is that the psychological process of basing my behavior toward, in the example at hand, someone shopping in my store, basing it in part upon their race, age, gender, and so on, when I have an empirical experience, which is people have been stealing from my store, and I've noticed in the historical record that disproportionately they belong to this group, is a natural reaction for a person. And moreover, that if I want to redress the problem, I need to include within the discussion the behavior of people in this group, not everyone for sure, that leads to there being this general belief in the minds of the store manager that a certain category of customers are a threat to shoplifters' goods. That's what I'm saying. And
I mean, Glenn, if you see somebody doing something wrongful, if your cameras have detected them, if you see somebody, in the usual operation of your work, then of course you are entitled to confront them, but that is individual specific. But there was a case just a couple of weeks ago of a guy who's himself a businessman, actually. I think this was in California, I'm not sure, but who had bought the very first basketball for his kid, a young child, I think 5 years old or something. He was there with his family. and left the store after paying for it, was chased out by a manager. Manager told him in no uncertain terms that he had stolen it and that he's got to put it back. And
but you're not addressing my question. That case of an individual who was innocent,
yes,
and who was treated badly by a store manager based upon a superficial association, was wrong. The store manager ought not to have treated the person badly.
But why did she think he was? The store manager believed that he was guilty. She was absolutely certain of it. Now, why did she believe that? Why? Obviously, it couldn't have been because he was guilty, because he then, when the police came, he produced the receipt. And she went back into the store. I'm
assuming it's because the store manager saw that he belonged to a certain category by race, yes, age, and gender. And the store manager, at least subconsciously, was more alert to the possibility that individuals in that category could be wrongdoers. And therefore, whatever information that the store manager had got processed to the erroneous conclusion in this case, which it might not have gotten processed to in a case had the person not belonged to that category.
Yes, possibly.
Yeah, okay, so I agree about that. And now I'm adding, if I associate shoplifting with young persons of color who come into my suburban store because in the last year I've caught, 24 people, 20 of whom have been young persons of color shoplifting in my store, if that's the factual predicate, and if, as an outside observer, we're concerned about the unfairness of the process where people are scrutinized when they go into the store, do we not need to address ourselves to the underlying behavior that gave rise to that stereotype in the first place? Can we have a useful discussion of this matter in which we bracket that behavior and pretend that it doesn't exist?
Why is it necessary, when you condemn a particular kind of behavior, to attach it to particular identities? I don't understand. When we say that,
the frequency of the behavior being higher.
Okay. I mean, for example, there's we say, politicians should not lie to the public, for instance, or cheat from the public purse or engage in, corruption and bribery. It might well be the case that the majority of people who do this are men, but, male politicians, but we don't say that, males have a responsibility to reduce their extent of bribery, corruption, lying, infidelity, whatever it might be, we just treat these things as wrong, and we treat, our, when we make, our opinions about these things known, we do not do them by attaching them to particular identities. Why are you insistent that we ought to do this?
But we do. If I'm having a meeting with a student in my office,
yeah,
I leave the door open if she's female, because I don't want there to arise any suspicion that I might have behaved inappropriately. Do you think that a woman professor, she may well do, she may have that practice, do you think that she needs to protect herself against the possibility of a sexual harassment charge or something of that arising to the same degree as I might? Do you think that a Title IX review committee within the university would take exactly the same factual predicate, although reversing the genders of the people involved, and come to the same conclusion about the sexually inappropriate intent of the person, if the person is male or if he's female or she's female?
No, I don't. In fact, that's one of the points we make repeatedly in the book, is that, when police are making judgments of suspicion, they will take these things into account. When jurors are deciding whether somebody is guilty or innocent, they take them into account. When judges are deciding on bail decisions, they take it into account. When parole boards are deciding on release, they take it into account. Everybody takes it into account, always. The question is, what are the rules that we want our society to live by? And, our determination to insist on probable cause, for example, for invasive searches, to insist on reasonable suspicion for police stops and searches, is constraining law enforcement in ways that we think are justified, even though it does lead to...
I want to be clear, I'm not arguing against that position. That is the position that there need to be rules, and that in the case of the use of public force in policing and detaining citizens, those rules need to eschew the use of racial stereotypes. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I'm talking about ordinary behavior
ordinary behavior
of people who own businesses that are subject to shoplifting,
well,
for example.
we started.
Or of individuals who might be robbed on the street. You were just giving the example yourself. I'm more likely to be robbed by an African-American if he thinks he can rob me, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm a white kid walking in a certain neighborhood at a certain time of day.
Right.
You can't be asking me to not pay attention to what category the people who I encounter at 1 o'clock in the morning belong to. I'm sure you're not doing that. You don't blame me. But I'm trying to raise the question of whether or not the behavior of people, the few people, if I take all African-American young men on the street at 1 o'clock in the morning, the percentage of them bent on robbery is a low number. It's a very low number. The cost of robbery is a high number. The cost to me of avoiding this person is relatively low. I'm going to avoid them. The numbers don't have to be that big for me to rationally choose to avoid them. And if you don't want me to cross the street, don't you need to tell some of the young black men, you say, don't ascribe their aberrant behavior to their race. I don't do so in a causal way, but I do so in a categorical way, as any observer would do.
I am not suggesting that people shouldn't cross the street. Jesse Jackson himself has observed more than once that he crosses the street when he's fearful. And I'm not, yes, in the book, we do say that we ought to become more self-aware of our beliefs, and we ought to be more receptive to evidence that might contradict them. And that's something that I'm comfortable telling everybody. But I'm not saying that somebody who's fearful should not act in ways that ease the level of fear that they're under. That's not at all what I'm saying. But what I find, a bit peculiar is the idea that an entire group, whether it is defined by race or ethnicity or gender even, ought to somehow take responsibility for the members, for the few members within that group that act in aberrant ways or act in destructive ways. I mean, people ought not to act in destructive ways. We as a society ought to try to make it so that happens less often, that people are protected, that people are safe. But why is it that a group should shoulder the responsibility of a minority of its members? I just don't see it. I don't see why we should insist that be the case.
You don't think that the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, which might set as its objective protection of the collective reputation of the Jews, or the Anti-Italian Anti-Defamation League, or whatever its appropriate name is, concerned that people think Italians are mobsters because a few mobsters are Italians, and so on.
Yeah.
You don't think they have, this is a public goods problem. I belong to the group. People deal with me as a member of the group. Other people who look like me, when they take an action, affect the way in which I'm treated based upon the processes that you and I have been discussing here.
Right.
So we're all in this thing together, willy-nilly. We're drawn together as a group by the sheer fact that we share a category together and their externalities. Yep. But of course, it's not merely that mechanical statistical association that binds me to other people in the group. For example, I get angry when something happens to somebody else in my group because I think that it could happen to me, and I act politically on the basis of that anger.
Yes.
For example, I take pride in the accomplishments of people in the group. And moreover, I remonstrate when I feel that those accomplishments are not sufficiently honored in the larger public. I'm looking for people like me in an environment when I go in there. Otherwise, it's not sufficiently diverse, and I'm complaining about the lack of diversity. So it's not as if this imposition of group consciousness is something that I'm just doing for the sake of making
I
black people responsible for the crimes of criminal black people. It's not the only way I'm using.
I understand, Glenn. I understand, Glenn. The pride that you take has a counterpart in the concern and the criticisms that you make. But that is very much, to me, it seems out of love for a group of which one is a member. When other people point fingers and say, you people should do it this way, you should bring out, it's in bad faith often. And I just feel that there's a huge gulf, in motive and in effect and in meaning. And you have pointed out, Glenn, in your own work, that many of the conversations that take place in private, within a particular group are much more frank and open and critical and free, in a sense, than the conversations that take place in public. And that makes sense, actually. There's this idea of not airing one's dirty laundry in public. And that's an understandable psychological impulse. But, to criticize one's own group out of love and understanding and out of concern about the effects that they're having on fellow group members, which I take you to be justifying, and which I think is justified, is really quite different from pointing fingers at another group and saying, you people are not taking care of your own issues and your own problems. That to me is fundamentally distasteful. That's my view.
Okay, no, I appreciate your view. I share your view about that. The distinction is an important one to make. And the conundrum here is that should I, out of love, as you put it, criticize my group, which is to say the little gangbangers running around St. Louis or Chicago or Camden, New Jersey or whatever, with their gang warfare, killing up people and making black people look bad.
Yeah, but bear in mind.
The problem is that I can't do that in a church basement, isolated from anybody else, with motives very different from my own, hearing it.
Yes.
Heather McDonald, God love her, is bound to hear you say that.
Yes, of course.
And she may then take that to say, you see there, I told you so.
But Glenn, about this level of violence, which you're right, that there are pockets of it that are very extreme. About that, part of what we're trying to do in this book is to demystify it, right? Because quite often it is interpreted in essentialist ways, what you call essentialist, which is basically, look, this is what these people are just like. There's nothing to be done. And I'm trying to say, look, there are incentives that they face.
Yeah.
And those incentives are going to affect their actions in predictable ways. And that economics actually can teach us something about those things.
Yeah.
And they are human beings like you and me, but in very different circumstances, in very different situations. And yes, you are right that they bear moral culpability, moral responsibility for their actions. But at the same time, we ought not to lose sight of the incentives that they're facing, which are often hidden. We don't see them as clearly from the outside.
I find that a very helpful observation. It's a little bit of what I was getting at when I tried to get you to put a number on what percentage of the racial disparity in homicide rates, let's say.
I wish I could.
Accounted for by these incentives. Well, you need the right kind of data in the
it's hard.
Experimental design. It's a very difficult inference problem.
Yeah.
But the anti-essentialism impulse that you give voice to here is one that I want to associate with myself with. Because these disparities are huge. I'm about to launch this course on race and inequality that I teach here at Brown for the upcoming semester.
Yes.
And the first lecture is on disparities, and you present all these graphs and you see all these numbers, and these disparities are very big.
Yes.
So just as a common sense kind of thing, you see these disparities, and then the question becomes why. And there are these master narratives, like discrimination and bias and white supremacy and whatnot, which do not completely persuade, at least not without elaboration, for many people. And the temptation is to repair to some kind of, those people are really different. That culture is really different. There's something, it doesn't have to be biogenetic. I mean, it could be behavioral and cultural. They don't marry, they don't raise their kids the same way. They're not like us and whatnot. And that's, of course, poisonous. I mean, politically, it leads to people disengaging, a lack of empathy and inability to see there, but for the grace of God go I, a lack of willingness to accommodate and to modify policies to give people a better chance. Because after all, if they're really just different, thuggish, violent, lazy, dull, not especially sharp-witted or whatever it is, if they're immoral, if they have flaws of character, they can't be trusted, et cetera, there's no point in bending over backwards to try to accommodate them.
Yeah, Glenn, about this, so there's a chart in the book. I'm not sure if this is exactly related to what you just said, but I think it's an important thing to consider. The United States, 2 generations ago had incarceration levels that were, roughly comparable with other countries at similar levels of economic development. It wasn't a huge outlier. And then you had this massive increase in incarceration, which for the first part of the period went hand in hand with an increase in criminal offending.
Yeah.
But then, when crime peaked around 1990, and it's come down very, very substantially since then, incarceration kept going up. It kept going up until about 10 years ago when it's flattened and slightly decreased now. You know this very well. You've written a lot about incarceration.
Right.
However, one of the things, and the racial disparities in the incarceration rates in the United States are very, very significant and very substantial. But there's one fact that doesn't get a lot of attention, and that is that the white incarceration rate in the United States exceeds the incarceration rates of overall incarceration rates, not just white, overall incarceration rates of every single OECD country by some margin. And of course, this was not the case, a couple of generations ago. It was not the case. Now, one doesn't view that in sort of racial or ethnic terms. It's not as if, somehow, white Americans are more thuggish or more criminal or more, than say, Europeans, with much, much lower rates of white incarceration. Forget about white incarceration. Look at European overall incarceration is less than white incarceration in the United States. Now, the thing is that, why is this? So the narrative, so again, to talk a little bit about what you just said, the narrative of the rise in incarceration being a response to the civil rights movement. This is, this is
I've heard it.
That one. Yeah. And I think there's truth to it. I think a lot of these things have some truth to it, and it makes a certain sense. How then does one account for the fact that white incarceration is so high? Of course, the disparities are extremely high, but how is it that white incarceration in the United States is now, way above incarceration rates overall of any country with comparable levels of economic development? Now, one possibility, and we don't know the answer, but one possibility that we look at in the book is an argument that's been made by Brian Stevenson in Just Mercy and by Paul Butler, whose book I mentioned earlier, is that, once a practice is introduced, especially in a system that is nominally colorblind, its expansion, then starts to become hard to restrain, hard to contain. Brian Stevenson, actually uses the case of George Stinney. It's a terrible, terrible execution, I think in the 1940s, of this boy. He's very, very young, so slim that they had to put a stack of Bibles to electrocute him. He couldn't sit on the chair high enough. But the idea of treating children like that. So Brian Stevenson's view is that it originated because people were willing to accept the treatment of black children like that.
No, I get it.
And then it just grows.
A coarsening of public sensibilities occasioned by the abuses of white supremacist domination of blacks that
and then it comes
leaches into the larger culture.
I think that has happened. Yeah, and it could be that the decarceration effects that have been in evidence to some extent for the last 10 years or so are flowing from the realization that it's gone this far. I don't know, but it's just a fact that doesn't get a whole lot of attention.
Yeah, I think that could be the subject of another conversation between us, Rajiv. This one has probably run its course. Okay. And I want to thank you and commend to people's attention your book with Brendan O'Flaherty, Shadows of Doubt, Harvard University Press, just out. I'm proud to call you my friend and look forward to talking with you at the Glenn Show again sometime soon.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Bye-bye.
Bye.